Hi Minerva makers, my name is Melanie and welcome to this Minerva sew-along. Today we'll be learning how to make Simplicity 8606 in a beautiful viscose fabric. This wrap skirt is really easy to make and is suitable for beginners. It feels so light and breezy to wear. The waist size is adjustable so it's forgiving for weight changes and can be worn over other clothes. It's the perfect skirt for summer. In this sew-along, we'll be learning how to make a flounce, how to make a perfect narrow hem, and how to sew on the ditch. I hope you'll give this project a try for yourself, and let's get started. For this sew-along, I'll be following Simplicity 8606 in View D, which is the short skirt with a flounce. This pattern has different lengths and flounce options, so it's highly reusable if you're building your wardrobe. This pattern comes in sizes 6 to 22. At the back of the pattern you'll find the suggested fabric, body measurements for each size, fabric quantity, and finished garment lengths. Choose your size based on your waist measurement as this skirt is free. The waist measurement is the slimmest part of your middle. I'm using a size 14 for this skirt. The fabric I'm using today is a high quality viscose with a red print. The fabric is light and has a beautiful drape, perfect for flounces. The fabric is about 150 centimeters wide, so you'll need about 2 meters depending on your size. I pre-washed the fabric by soaking it with some detergent and giving it a wash. This fabric needs to be ironed on the synthetic setting and not higher. To stiffen the waistband, you'll need some interfacing. You'll need about 1.3 meters of a light fusible interfacing. I'm using Vilene, which holds well to viscose fabric. You can find a link for the fabric, interfacing, and pattern in the description so you can steal this look for yourself. The equipment that you'll need today include your sewing machine. To make the inside of the skirt beautiful, I'm using an overlocker with matching thread. Matching thread and a bobbin to wind it on, thread in a contrasting color and another bobbin, fabric shears, paper scissors, measuring tape, tailor's chalk or erasable fabric marker, a quicken pick, and pins. To sew viscose of this weight, you will need sharp or Microtex machine needles in size 70. Here at Minerva we stock a wide range of haberdashery and sewing equipment which is suitable for every craft project. I suggest signing up to the Minerva Craft Club and you'll receive an extra 10% off your order. It really helps if you need to get high quality equipment. This pattern has multiple lines to represent each of the sizes. Take a highlighter or marker and trace around the line that represents your size. This will make it easier to cut. Cut around the outside of the pattern following the line for your size. To make View D, you will need to cut out pieces 2 to 6 and 10 to 11. For piece 3, each size has been printed separately, so you just need to cut the one that matches your size. You will notice for piece 2 and 6 there are multiple cutting lengths for each view. View D has the short cutting length, but to preserve the pattern, I suggest cutting the longest length for your size. When it comes to cutting the pieces out, you can simply fold the piece up to the View D cutting line. Let's go ahead and cut the fabric and interfacing in these pieces. This pattern comes with cutting layouts that you need to follow to help you cut out all the pieces with minimal fabric wastage. On the instructions, you'll find out 2 layouts for View D. Choose the layout based on the width of your fabric. My fabric is about 150 centimeters wide, so I'll be using the second layout. The layout shows that the selvages of the fabric needs to be brought together, so in other words, we need to fold the fabric in half widthwise. Pin the selvages together. The first piece that we will place is piece 2. On the cutting layout, this piece is shaded. This means that it needs to be placed upside down. The pieces that are not shaded need to be placed right sides up. This piece has a shorter cutting length for View D, so I'm going to place the piece so that the cutting line is above the end of the fabric. This prevents wastage of the fabric. All of the pieces for this skirt have grain line arrows. These arrows must be placed parallel with the selvage or the fold. This is essential to make sure that the fabric drapes properly and creates nice seams. Measure from the grain line arrow to the fold. Make sure that this distance is the same down the length of the arrow. Pin all the way around the pattern. We now need to fold the pattern up to the cutting line for view D and pin on top. When we cut the bottom of this piece, we can cut next to the fold that you just made for an accurate edge and to preserve the pattern. On the other side of the fabric next to the selvages, we need to place piece 12. Place the side with the grain line next to the selvage. Arrange it so that it won't cross over with piece 2. Make sure that the grain line is parallel with the selvages. Pin this piece into place. Use your fabric shears to cut close to the edge of the pattern. When you come across the triangles on the edge of the pattern piece, make small cuts into the fabric to transfer it. These markings are called notches and will help you match and align pieces as you sew. Cut next to the fold for the bottom of piece 2. Cut out piece 12 as well. Unfold the fabric and smooth it out. Place piece 5 next to the selvage. Align it with the selvage and pin. Grab piece 6. This piece also has a higher cutting line for view D. Place this piece next to piece 5 with the cutting line close to the end of the fabric. Align piece 6 with the selvage and pin. Just like with piece 2, fold up the pattern along the cutting line for view D. Above piece 6, we'll place the next piece, which is 11. Place this piece next to piece 5 and align it with the selvage. Cut out the pieces that you've pinned so far. Cut around the fold of the bottom of piece 6. Move the fabric along so you can work on the other selvage. Place piece 3, then 4 next to the selvage and pin. Grab piece 10 and place it in the leftover space next to piece 4. This piece is challenging to fit in, so make sure that you use as little space as possible between these pieces. Align the grain line arrow with the selvage and pin into place. Take piece 6 again. This time we need to pin it upside down above piece 10. Just like previously, align the pattern with the selvage, pin into place, and fold up the cutting line for view D. Lastly, we need to cut out piece 3 in the interfacing. I'm using fusible, aka iron-on interfacing. This type of interfacing has a shiny side with a glue on it. The side with the glue needs to be placed face up on the table. Grab piece 3. Place it right side up next to the selvage of the interfacing. Align the grain line arrow with the selvage and pin. Cut this piece out. Before we start to sew, we need to make a few preparations. Take piece 3 in the interfacing and fabric over to your ironing board. Place the waistband that you cut out in the fabric on the ironing board with the wrong side facing up. Grab the interfacing. Be careful to place the glue side of the interfacing down onto the fabric. Grab your iron, which should be on the synthetic setting. Press the iron down on the interfacing and hold it there until the interfacing sticks. Don't move the iron on top of the fabric. Just lift it up and press it back down again on the next section. Keep doing this until all of the interfacing is fused to the fabric. Next, we need to transfer all of the circle markings onto the pieces so we know which of them go together. On the waistband piece, there are several markings that need to be transferred. On each of the short ends, there is a set of 3 circle markings which will help us arrange the ties in the future. Place the pattern on top of the fabric and pin. Push a pin through the center of each of the circle markings and down through the fabric. Remove any pins which are in the way and gently lift up the pattern. At the base of each pin, make a marking with your tailor's chalk. Repeat this method to transfer all of the circle markings. On the bottom edge of the waistband, there are 2 more circle markings which will help us sew the skirt in the future. Transfer these markings onto the right side of the fabric. Place a pin next to the buttonhole. Fold back the pattern. Use your tailor's chalk to make a vertical marking next to the fold. Then make horizontal lines at each end. The last marking we need to make is on piece 6. This circle marking is only made on the left side and will help us place the flounce. Transfer this marking onto the right side of the fabric. Next, we will stay stitch the skirt pieces. Stay stitching is where we sew on top of a single layer of fabric to help prevent it from stretching, and it reinforces curved edges. Grab piece 6. The stay stitching needs to be sewn on the top edge. For this example, the stay stitching needs to be sewn from the side seam towards the front. We sew stay stitching towards the center of a piece to help prevent distortions in the fabric as it is sewn. Take piece 6 over to the sewing machine. Sew from the side towards the front at 1.3 centimeters. To help you remember, the front seam is the most curved side. Do this for both copies. Grab piece 2. We also need to stay stitch the top edge of this piece as well. This time, we need to sew from the side seam towards the center back. Keep in mind that the center back is the one with the triple notches on the side. Sew the stay stitching at 1.3 centimeters on a single layer. Do this for both copies. Now we can start sewing the skirt. Place a copy of piece 2 on the table with the right side facing up. Grab the other copy of piece 2 and place it down so that the right sides will be together. Match the notch for the triple back seam and pin these pieces together. At your sewing machine, sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance to make the back of the skirt. Sew from the top edge down for all the skirt and flounce pieces. Grab piece 6. Place each copy of piece 6 on top of piece 2 at the side seam. Match the single notch and pin into place. Pin both copies of piece 6 to the skirt back. Sew the side seam at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Bring the skirt over to the iron. Press the seams that you made so far split apart. Use your overlocker to finish the raw edges. Now the skirt is sewn up, we need to work on the flounce for the bottom. Grab pieces 10, 11 and 12. We need to stay stitch these pieces at the top edge, which is the curve on the inside. Sew a single layer at 1.3 centimeters. Sew from the side seam, which is the straight edge with the notch. Place a copy of piece 12 on the table with the right side facing up. Place the other copy on top. Pin these pieces together at the side seam with the triple notch, which is the center back. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. This creates the back of the flounce. Place the flounce on the table with the right side facing up. On the right edge of the flounce, we will sew piece 10. Place piece 10 on top at the side seam. Match the notches and pin together. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. On the left side of the flounce, we need to sew piece 11. Place piece 11 on top with the right sides together, matching the notches, and pin. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Bring the flounce over to the ironing board. Iron the seams split apart. Finish the raw edges with your overlocker. We are ready to hem the flounce. To make a weightless and neat flounce, we need to make narrow hems on the bottoms and sides. Bring the flounce over to the ironing board. On the wrong side, fold up the raw edge by 1.5 centimeters. Iron into place and pin. Change your sewing machine thread to a contrasting color for both the bobbin and the main thread. Change your stitch length to a maximum on a straight stitch. Grab your flounce. We need to sew the seam allowance of just a few millimeters from the fold on the wrong side. It will be best to use a clear foot for this so you can see the fold as you sew. Sew all along the bottom of the flounce. With your scissors, cut off the seam allowance that you just sewn. Cut as close as possible to the contrasting seam and as close as 1 millimeter from it. Flip the fold towards the wrong side of the flounce. Iron this new hem at about 2 or 3 millimeters seam allowance depending on how thick your fabric is. Pin into place. Change your thread back to a matching color and use the normal stitch length. Sew on top of the fold of the hem. This seam should be on or above the contrasting seam. Now we need to sew a narrow hem onto the sides of the flounce. Repeat the same process. Iron the raw edge by 1.5 centimeters on the wrong side. Sew on top of the fold with a contrasting thread and a long stitch. Iron up the fold on the wrong side by just 2 millimeters. Sew on top of the fold with your matching thread and normal seam allowance. Once you're done, use a quick unpick to pull out the contrasting thread. And you'll have a perfect narrow hem. And that's it, the flounce is all done and ready to attach to the skirt. We need to cut slits into the seam allowance of the stay stitching at the top edge of the flounce. Cut up to the stay stitching but not through it. This releases the tension on this highly curved seam when we sew it later. Lay out the skirt with the right side facing up. Place the top edge of the flounce on top of the bottom edge of the skirt with the right sides together. Try to place the flounce so that the corresponding seams are together. Place the tip of the flounce on the right upper corner of the skirt and pin. The left side of the flounce needs to be placed lower down on the skirt. Remember the circle marking that we transferred on the left side of the skirt? Place the hem of the flounce here. Pin into place. Now we need to align the seams for the flounce and the skirt. Place the seams together. Make a marking at 1.5 centimeters on top of the seam. Fold the first layer at 1.5 centimeters so that you can see the other seam underneath. Move the top layer around so that they will match. Place the top layer back down and pin. Do this for all 3 of the seams. Pin the rest of the flounce to the skirt. Sew the flounce to the skirt at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Grab your shears. Trim the seam allowance to about half. Finish the raw edge of your overlocker. Iron the seam allowance towards the top of the skirt. The last thing that we need to do for this skirt is to hem the space at the top left of the skirt above the flounce. At your ironing board, fold this raw edge over by 1.5 centimeters on the wrong side and press into place. Now fold under about half of the hem so that the raw edge is hidden and iron into place. Sew on top of the fold to create a neat finish. Moving on to sewing the waistband. Finish the top edge of piece 3. Bring it over to the iron. Fold up the top edge by 1.5 centimeters on the interfacing side of the waistband. We will now go ahead and sew the skirt to the waistband. Place the waistband on the table with the right side up. Now we need to place the top edge of the skirt on top of the bottom edge of the waistband. This is where we will use the circle markings that you transferred earlier. On each corner you have a marking. Place the side of the skirt on top of this marking and pin. Do this for both ends of the skirt. The other 2 markings at the bottom edge of the waistband are where you need to place the side seams of the skirt. Pin into place. Now you can go ahead and pin the entire skirt to the waistband. Sew the skirt to the waistband at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Trim off about half of the seam allowance. Iron it towards the waistband side and finish the raw edge. Now we will work on the ties for this wrap skirt. Grab pieces 4 and 5. Fold each of these pieces in half lengthwise and pin. We need to leave the ends with the circle markings open so that we can pull the ties through to the right side, so don't pin at the short ends. Sew where you have pinned at 1 centimeter seam allowance. My machine doesn't have a guide marking for 1 centimeter on the needle plate, so I'm lining up the raw edge with the side of my machine foot, which I know is 1 centimeter seam allowance. At the short end of the tie, I'm going to sew again at 1.3 centimeters around the corner. This is essential to reinforce the seam, otherwise the corners might break when you pull the tie the right side out. Sew both of the ties. Using your scissors, we need to carefully trim off all the seam allowance on the corners to create a neat edge. Trim up to the reinforcing seam but not through it. Then trim off about half of the seam allowance on the long side. Finish the raw edge. Now grab something long and thin with a blunt edge. I'm using the end of a pencil, but you can also use the end of a pen or a knitting needle. Press it into the short end of the tie. The end of the tie should start to go inside of itself. Keep pressing the needle inside of the tie until it completely turns itself inside out. Repeat for the other tie. At the ironing board, we need to press out the seams and flatten the tie. The ties are ready to use with the skirt. Each tie is a different length, so you need to be careful to put it on the right end. The right tie, or piece 4, is the shorter tie and needs to be placed on the right end of the waistband. The longer tie is piece 5 and it needs to be sewn on the left side of the waistband. Match the 2 circle markings to the waistband. Place the tie on top of the bottom half of the waistband. Sew the ties together to the waistband at 1 centimeter seam allowance to hold it in place. Fold the top half of the waistband down on top of the tie. The fold for the top of the waistband needs to be on top of the waist seam, pin into place. Do this for both ends of the waistband. Make sure that the ties are facing inwards. Sew the ends of the waistband together at 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Sew again at 1.3 centimeters to reinforce the seam. Cut off all the seam allowance at the corners, then finish the raw edge. Push the waistband the right way out. The ties should start at the end of the waistband, and we now have the facing. On the wrong side, the bottom of the facing still needs to be attached to the skirt. Bring the skirt up to the ironing board with the wrong side facing up. We need to move the fold of the facing so that it covers the waist seam. Put your tape measure on top of the waist seam and move the fold so it's covering the top of it by 3 millimeters. Use your iron to press the top of the waistband. Hold the waistband with one hand and flip it over to show the right side. Push a pin through all the layers on the right side. We need the pins to be on the right side as this is the side that we'll be sewing from. Keep doing this down the length of the waistband. We'll now be using the sewing on the ditch method to close the waistband. This method involves directly sewing on top of the waist seam and catching the fold of the facing on the other side to close the waistband. Bring the skirt up to the sewing machine. The needles should be set on the center straight stitch. Place the end of the waistband into the machine. The waist seam should be almost in the center of the foot. We need to sew as close as possible to the waist seam on the skirt side. As you sew, flatten the seam as much as possible. Once you're done, the seam that you just made should be hidden under the waistband. On the other side of the skirt, the facing is sewn down with a neat seam on top of the fold. The last thing that we need to do is make an opening in the waistband to bring the tie through. We'll be making a buttonhole above the side seam. On the waistband pattern piece, this buttonhole is about 2.5 centimeters long. Check your sewing manual on how to sew a buttonhole. Here's how to do it on my machine. Grab your buttonhole foot. At the end of the foot, there's a buttonhole guide plate where you would normally put your button. For this buttonhole, we're going to open it up until it measures about 2 centimeters. The machine will add extra length when it creates the buttonhole, so this should be fine for the tie. Swap your normal sewing machine foot for the buttonhole foot and pull down the lever. Change your stitch length to a rectangle buttonhole. Bring the skirt up to the machine. We need to place the skirt so that the buttonhole foot is covering the length of the buttonhole and is facing towards the skirt. In the space for the needle, you should be able to see the lines that you drew for the buttonhole. Try to arrange the horizontal lines so that it matches the arrows on the foot. Now we can start sewing. Let the machine do the work while we gently guide the fabric. Once the buttonhole is done, pull out the skirt from the machine and cut the thread. Place a pin at the end of the buttonhole. At the other end, we will use a quick unpick to rip a hole down the center. The pin at the other end prevents us from ripping too far through the hole, which is really easy to do. And we're all done. Today we learned how to sew a really easy yet beautiful wrap skirt. How gorgeous and swishy are the flounces. This is the type of quality you can't buy but is so easy to make. Thanks for joining me in this sewing tutorial video. Today we learned how to make a wrapped flounce skirt. It was really easy as well. I'm confident even beginners can make this skirt with the help of this tutorial. I hope you'll give this project a try for yourself. Feel free to post it to the Minerva website. We'd love to see your interpretation of this pattern. Please follow Minerva for more inspirations, tutorials, and craft ideas. Leave a comment below. We'd love to read it. Thanks for watching.